Announcing the arrival of guests of honor, please. Good evening and salam sa Indonesia. Yang berbahagia, Tan Sri Dato' Sri Megat, Najib Dato' Sri Dr. Haji Megat, Vice National University Fair, House Manager and Non-Executive Director of QIUP. Yang berusaha, Encik Muhammad Zainal Abidin Muhammad, Senior Principal Assistant Director of the Department of Higher Education, who will be representing Yang berusaha, Dr. Muhammad Nur Ahmad bin Hassan, Deputy Director General of Higher Education. Yang berbahagia, Dr. Professor Dr. Natarajan, Vice Chancellor of West National University, Perak, Mr. Nicholas Goh, Chief Operating Officer of West National University, Perak, Mr. Daniel Hassan, Organizing Chairman and Co-founder of WUPID, Associate Professor Dr. Chandran, Chief Educator of WUPID 2017, the Executive Advisor of Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking, Human Resources Director, Minister of Malaysian Director, and Dr. Chua Chow, Executive Director of Scripture Rahman. Distinguished guests, debaters and educators of WUPID 2017, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, Welcome to the grand finals and closing ceremony of QIUP WUPID 2017. My name is Alison from the Malaysian Institute of Public Speaking and Our MC for tonight. The Welsh University's thesis invitation today was founded in 2007 with the objective of inviting the best and best debaters in the world to discuss and debate about peace-related issues and to formulate possible conflict resolutions during rounds. For many years, WUPID has seen wide participation of over 30 top university debating groups that includes top Ivy League universities and top institutions around Asia, Australia, and Europe. This year, WUPID saw the participation of 32 teams from 19 institutions from Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, United Kingdom, Philippines, and Indonesia. After 4 preliminary rounds and 2 elimination rounds, we have arrived at the grand finals of this year's WUPID 2017. I'd like to congratulate all grand finalists that made it last year. An opening garland, we have London School of Economics LSA that has Saray and Razzaq Fazail. On opening opposition, we have Sydney A, from Clyde, Welsh, we have Pacino. On closing government, we have NUS A, University of Colin Wu. And on closing opposition, we have Oxford A, of Clyde and Musulin. Chairing the grand final is the Associate Dr. Chandran from University of Malaya, Amrit Agastia from University, Harish, Natarajan, formerly of Heritage University, Jessica Musulin of Australian National University, and Ameera Natasha from International Islamic University. Before we begin the grand finals, a few housekeeping rules. Firstly, please turn off or keep your phone on silent, and only leave in between speeches, not during speeches that do not distract the debaters that are speaking. Without further ado, on the motion, this House believes that the United States should add all support to Saudi Arabia and invite the Prime Minister to be the
Saudi Arabia is at a critical juncture. It is at the point where it's starting to transition its power from the old king to the new crown prince, MBS, and it's a point in which it has some degree of economic modernization and liberalization that we think are good, but also lots of remnants of the military expansionism and the military campaigns that we think are bad. It has lots of remnants of the kind of political power plays that we think result in unwise political plays. That means that you have human rights abuses, you have unclear political rights that are according to the people. And the result of this is a very bad regime that we think we need to sanction. On our side, we think that there are 3 big things that we don't like about Saudi Arabia. The first is that it isolates Qatar, which reduces the amount of freedom of information within the region. It actively is working against the freedom of information that people have within their region to allow them to make good informed decisions. The second is that they are funding the war in Yemen, which we think is highly costly. It's probably not going to work out very well, and it's resulting in regional instability that further perpetuates the kind of geopolitical struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the third is that it purges off members within its own political landscape, which means there is a less stable political landscape. It's a further consolidation of power. That we are worried that this results in more radical behaviors from the ruling party and from MBS after he's able to consolidate power. Those are the things that we want to see them solve. Therefore, what do we want to see on our side of the house? We argue that by removing all support from the US to Saudi Arabia, this means that we can prevent the consolidation of power to MBS. We can nudge them towards better economic liberalization policies as a form of legitimacy, rather than relying on expensive military campaigns that we think they would much rather stop, and that we think are very reliant on US support for technological aid as well as military aid. And we think that at the end of the day, this results in better Saudi policies for various reasons I'll go through in this speech. What is our policy, therefore? We think that we will end this policy at a point in which Saudi Arabia pulls out of Yemen, makes way for a peace deal, and stops trying to puppeteer the Lebanon leader, for example, and also at the point where it just stops putting that money into the military. We argue that the US, as having primarily funded lots of money to Saudi Arabia, that's predominantly going into things like the military campaigns, has an interest in stopping that from doing so at a point in which it reduces the kind of regional stability that you have. I'm going to go through a couple of things. I'm going to go through many reasons why this will be effective, and we'll be dealing with arguments from backlash and what happens in the worst case scenario, and then I'm going to talk briefly about what the US interest is. So firstly, why is this going to be effective? On the first level of argumentation, we argue that this is a timely juncture for Saudi Arabia, where MBS needs the US support and is incredibly dependent on the US, right? It's dependent on the US in terms of military aid because of its campaigns in Yemen, but it's also particularly overextended, especially given the context and the forecasting of rising instability within the Middle East. At the point where, for example, the US has antagonized like parties within the Israel-Palestine deal, has antagonized lots of other parties within the Middle East. This is a point in time where Saudi Arabia will likely need to consolidate its military power by bringing it closer back to home rather than reaching out further into Yemen, especially without military support. Therefore, when we reduce and we remove the military support that we think we give to Saudi Arabia to be able to continue its military campaign in Yemen, it is likely to pull out. But secondly, we argue that the economic reforms in a minute, the economic reforms that Saudi Arabia is trying to push through are ones that particularly rely on US support, right? It requires, for example, having a knowledge-based economy in Jeddah, for example, requires an investment into artificial intelligence, requires the US kind of technological overtures they are unable to get from other parties. So it needs the kind of technological and capital incentive support that the US is able to provide. So it's likely to see to what the US wants and wants to resume US support for these campaigns. Yes.
This isn't a retrospective position. Having already committed to a war in Yemen, it is more likely in a position and situation of instability that the MBS regime will double down because they can't afford a political loss and will try and obtain a political victory. Your side entrenches the war.
No, because we think that because it doesn't want a political loss, that's why it's not going to pull out now, independent, outside of the US removing the support. When the US removes their support, this gives it justification and legitimacy to be able to pull out and still save face politically, because it says, oh, the US is trying to create all these puppeteering, and being involving in these things, and they can say that they're listening to US direction in the interest of more important things, like improving the massively high youth unemployment rate, for example, and regaining kind of economic gains they have. The third reason why we think that is dependent, that is unable to survive on its own, is because oil prices are just going to be low and are unlikely to regain a high that it was earlier on pre-2014. This means that it knows that it has to build up a sustainable economy outside of resource-rented oil rents. And that's precisely what MBS recognizes is best for its economy. At the point in which he's trying to liberalize its economy to be less dependent on oil, he's trying to privatize Aramco. Those are the things that suggest that he wants to move away from the oil dependency. This means that it still needs US support in order to diversify its economy and needs US buy-in in terms of investors, especially at the point where the biggest Saudi investors are ones that are opposing MBS's policies and have already been purged. Okay, so we think that it's still going to be, that it is a timely juncture for this to be the most effective as it is. We also argue on the second level that this is a good point within their rule to be able to pivot away from the kind of military overtures that previously dominated Saudi Arabia's rule. MBS was previously defense minister, and that's why most of his legitimacy was through military campaigns. That doesn't mean that he's predisposed to those military campaigns, insofar as he's now crown prince and obviously interested, as you can see, in more economic reforms. So thanks. This means there is a good point in which he's able to pivot, where he's not too far invested within military campaigns and still has time to build up his economic legitimacy. Secondly, why do we think that there is not going to be backlash on their side? We argue that the backlash in terms of coming from the ruling elite is unlikely because they don't have alternatives. The military aid required from the US is one that's too technologically advanced to be able to go to other parties. We think that they're unlikely to go, for example, to Russia, because Russia is in an economically weak position right now. At the point where the ruble is particularly low, oil prices also affecting Russia, and Russia is overextended in Syria. But most importantly, fighting against Saudi Arabian forces within Syria, because they're fighting on two different sides of the conflict, is unlikely to go to Russia for that aid. But secondly, it's unlikely to go to China as well, because the state monopoly that Aramco has within the oil economy, as well as the way the Saudi Arabian economy is structured, means that it's unlikely that China is able to penetrate the market, particularly when Saudi Arabia doesn't have a very high level of purchasing power within its large migrant population. Most of the purchasing power is concentrated within the Saudi Arabian citizen elite. The last argument, therefore, is that why necessarily this will not empower, this will be within the US interest. We argue that this is within the US interest because it preserves the US position of strength as a negotiator within the Middle East. This is a time when the Middle East is going to be increasingly unstable and increasingly requires stabilizing presence of the US. By continuing to support Saudi Arabia without conditions, it is one that weakens the US ability to have credible negotiations with other players such as Iran. It's only when you show that you care about what Saudi Arabia does, you give resources and aid only on condition of what Saudi Arabia does in your your interests, and they're able to rein in Saudi Arabia, then you're most able to get the kind of credible commitment for negotiations. Proud to propose.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Now I can invite the Leader of Opposition, you have the floor. Kenya.
At the point that the US ends support for Saudi Arabia will still try to isolate Qatar. Saudi Arabia will still fund the war in Yemen. Saudi Arabia will still engage in leadership purges, which we probably support anyway because they're mainly of corrupt officials. What this team did not prove was that Saudi Arabia did not have any alternatives. We thought they did have alternatives. We thought it was very easy to buy arms from Russia, very easy to buy arms from Pakistan, and the Saudis did not need the US more than they, for example, needed the war in Yemen to counter the threat of Iran, needed to isolate Qatar to counter their threat to power in the region, and the Saudis focus on maintaining that power, when they could do so with the support of Russia, was always going to trump any interest in returning to US alliance under any conditions. 3 parts of this speech, rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, why this is bad for regional stability. Secondly, questioning how Saudi Arabia would actually respond. Finally, on how you best moderate Saudi Arabia. Firstly, on regional stability. We think the first thing to note about this is that the United States needs a reliable ally in the Middle East to counter Iran. The perspective of the United States is largely ignored by this opening government team. Opening opposition won't make that mistake. We think the context is one, no thank you, of where Iran is fomenting instability in the Middle East, where Iran is, for example, trying to build a military land corridor through Syria during the civil war there, where, for example, Iran is taking steps to already violate the nuclear deal that was signed just a few years ago, where Iran is trying to encourage the Shia population in Iraq and is actively undermining the sovereignty of the Iraqi government. All of that means that the United States necessarily needs an ally in the Middle East that can counter the threat of Iran, necessarily needs an ally that can stop those things from happening. There are no alternatives for that ally to be anyone other than Saudi Arabia. Iraq is unstable. Egypt is unstable. Israel is not trusted by anyone else in the region. And what that all means is that the only relevant power broker, the only relevant actor that the United States can depend on as an ally is Saudi Arabia. They're the only viable ally. That alliance is especially crucial for a few reasons. That's because that alliance provides the United States with a base for military operations, provides the United States essentially with a seat at the OPEC negotiating table and influence within the Arab League, but importantly provides them with information and logistics, for example, in the war on terror. This team claims that the Saudis will likely stop their war in Yemen, that the Saudis are currently engaging in all kinds of terrible wars and all kinds of conflicts that we should condemn. We think the Saudis are already demonstrating signs that they're doing better as an ally, that they're working closer. They've conducted joint military exercises with countries like Israel. They've shown an interest in aligning with the United States to counter Iran, to counter Iran, which means that the United States has significantly more leverage. All of that means that, regardless of the impact of Saudi Arabia, the United States, as the best actor in the region, has a significant interest in supporting Saudi Arabia as an ally. That was not addressed by opening government at all. It's hugely consequential in this debate for the sake of regional stability. But the second part of this speech then, how is Saudi Arabia likely to respond? The claim that we get is that the Saudis will do things like pull out of Yemen. They'll do things like re-engage with Qatar. The Saudi Arabians need that war in Yemen. They need to counter the threat of Iran far more than they need the United States. The United States is but one source of military arms, is but one source of economic investment. And the reality is they're not going to stop a war on their doorstep that if they lose, the Iranians will essentially have control over Yemen for the sake of an ally that they don't really need. We think that this overwhelming motivation of the Saudis is power and military influence within the region to counter Iran. Necessarily, they will turn to other weapon suppliers. This opening government team, no thank you, mentioned Russia once. We think they are one of the most important actors in this debate because that is the alternative that Saudi Arabia will turn to. They will continue to bomb civilians in Yemen. They will continue to isolate Qatar. They will just do so with the support of Russian investment, with the support of Russian arms deals. That is comparatively worse for a few reasons. Note that already the Saudis are improving their relations with Russia. They're improving their relations with Putin. They're already opening up this option in case the United States decides to bail on. But why is that comparatively worse? Two reasons. Firstly, Putin's actions in Syria and the rest of the Middle East have already proven his disinterest in essentially the rules of law in preventing things like collateral damage. He doesn't have to, for example, report to a democratic populace. He doesn't have to be held accountable by ordinary people who are interested in preventing collateral damage. He can essentially do what he wants. That's what he's been doing in Syria. We think the wars that the Saudis will conduct, no thank you, will be much less accountable when they're funded by Russian arms. But the second thing to say is that at the point that the Saudis and Russia are now allies, that manufactures an alliance between the two biggest oil producers in the world. That creates an oligopoly, which is hugely dangerous, not just to the West, not just to Europe, but to the entire world, because all oil buyers are now in a much worse position. That locks out the United States, that locks out Europe, and that ensures that there is no moderation of oil prices. There is no moderation to ensure that developing countries who are not allied with Russia or the Saudis have access to the oil that they need. That means that Saudi Arabia's response is necessarily not going to be to return to kowtow to the United States. It's going to be to return to Russia. That is in the interest of Russia. It would be in the interest of Saudi Arabia, and that would be far worse for the region, far worse for the world when you consider oil prices. The response that we get in terms of Russia is that Russia is economically weak. Firstly, that is not relevant. In fact, it is an incentive for Russia to sell arms at the point it can make money from selling tanks, money from selling bombs to Saudi Arabia. But the economic position of the Saudis, in the sense that they're trying to build a knowledge economy and the economy that we're hearing about in Jeddah, does not depend on trade with the United States, does not depend on trade with Europe, for example. It depends on its role economically in the Middle Eastern region, and that is unchanged regardless of whether the United States or Russia is Saudi's ally. We think that the alternative is Russia. That alternative is worse. That is how the Saudis will respond. That will make the Middle East a less peaceful place. Final part of this speech. What will best moderate Saudi Arabia? I'll take a POI from open. Or closing.
All right. Have you heard of shale gas? And
What are you doing?
Sorry?
Have you heard of shale gas and what its impact is on energy sufficiency?
We think the impact on energy sufficiency is that you trade an unholy alliance with the two biggest oil producers in the world. That would be far worse for all buyers, including Shell. That would be far worse because these two countries will have an essential monopoly over oil production. That would be bad for the world as a whole. How will you best moderate the Saudis? Note the context. We support the Crown Prince in his actions. His purges have been against corrupt officials. We think that's a good thing. He's liberalizing when it comes to corruption. He's liberalizing when it comes to women's rights. We think he's getting extensive advice, for example, from McKinsey regarding economic liberalization. The government wants to prevent the Crown Prince from consolidating his power. We think that is a bad thing. We think he's the best alternative. He's the most liberal option. And the only other alternative is a rotating door of various conservative leaders that King Abdullah does not trust. That is not a good alternative in this debate. We think, firstly, that the United States now has the capacity to influence and moderate as long as it's an ally. It can legitimize the Crown Prince and consolidate power. It has leverage to push for liberalization. The comparative, importantly, is that the Saudis will instead depend on extremism to maintain power, will depend on spreading Wahhabism, will depend on riling up Sunnis in Iraq in a world where their only way to maintain power is through extremism and encouraging the forces of Sunnis throughout the Middle East rather than depending on the United States. That makes the Saudis less moderate. The response of Saudi Arabia will not be to go back to the United States. Its response will be to continue doing what it's always been doing, just under the purview of Russia. That is far worse for the Middle East. That is far worse for Saudi Arabia. So proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech. Now I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to the floor. Thank you.
Yes. Opening opposition tried to tap their hands into too many debates here. They want to solve the problem in Iran, as well as in Yemen. But most of all these benefits, if you realize, are contingent upon Saudi Arabia abiding by the US interests in all instances. That is to say, that in their world, without any form of, say, sanction or nudge, which we provide in our policy, Saudi Arabia will always back everything that's within US's interest. That is the main problem with that case. Because Sarah outlined very clearly, in this debate, for us to win, it's about proving which side upon our policy allows forces Saudi Arabia to change, and why Saudi Arabia necessarily will change the direction that we want to as a result of this sanction/withdrawal of support. In this speech, we'll deal with a few things. One, I'll tell you why there are no other alternatives Saudi Arabia can rely on besides the US. Second, I'm going to talk about why then will the change be such that it will be according to US interests. So let's deal with their best alternative, Russia. I think like it's very disingenuous to say like because Russia is economically incapable, is more willing to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. It's necessarily incognizant of the kinds of political power that exist in other parts of the region within the Middle East. Russia is a staunch supporter of Assad, who is currently battling a legion of individuals who are supported and backed by MBS and Saudi Arabia. It is also the largest ally of the second strongest, arguably, Shia government in that particular region. What that means is that it's unlikely Russia is suddenly going to support Saudi Arabia as a result of this policy, because it literally doesn't make sense for Russia to have two allies within the Middle East when one of them is literally antithetical to Saudi Arabia. But secondly, it is that's the reason why Russia, at best, can't provide any sort of military aid. But the difference is, right, the economic reforms that you have, the economic problems that you have in Russia is more of a reason why any sort of help you can get is comparatively worse off. What does this mean? The fall of the ruble, the decline in oil prices, the fact that at this point, because of the presence of US shale gas, the price of oil will never go beyond $70. Russia is structurally incapable of providing military aid or economic aid to an extent that can help Saudi Arabia the way they are sustaining their wars right now. And what that means is that their alternatives literally mean Saudi Arabia is one cornered and unable to rely on an ally that cannot exist anyway. So assuming Russia is willing to support them, it's not a support that will allow them to operate the same level of operation right now as they do. And that is the problem. But furthermore, what we also tell you is that uniquely, Sarah provided that the economic reforms Saudi Arabia are going for, one is depending on the US. The IPO from Aramco is competing, there's several stock market exchanges competing for the IPO in Aramco. What it means are all these stock market exchanges are necessarily ones in the West, ones like the NYSE or even the London Stock Exchange. What that means is in order for them to gain any sort of reform and ability to necessarily operate, they need the economy of the US and its allies in order to necessarily kickstart the sort of reforms that allows them to be less dependent on oil. That is why that dependency is ultimately something that isn't necessarily, doesn't necessarily allow for Russia to be an alternative. But what's worse, they tell us in the absence of Russia, or in the absence of US support, you can still fund the same sort of wars that exist in Yemen or even the sort of isolation that you have in Qatar. Untrue. The reason why is that right now Saudi Arabia is already operating a budget deficit of 10%. It's forced to introduce taxes to its citizens for the first time. It's unable to cope the sort of lavish spending of its people. What that means is, uniquely, literally the desperation to reform its economy is at its peak right now than any other point. The US will strategically take advantage of that and go for it. That is the difference. Before I move on to why Saudi Arabia will change in a certain way, go.
You claim that the IPO is happening in the West, ergo you need US aid. You're from the London School of Economics. Why can't they quote the damn thing on the London Stock Exchange or any other Western market?
I mean, like, look, if the US withdraws support from Saudi Arabia, obviously this means the US and its allies, it's very likely the same sort of support you get from the EU and from the UK is also the same way due to things like NATO, etc., etc. And I think it's very likely the case that this is going to be a Western coalition, especially when their alternatives were literally Russia. That means you have a Western support for this kind of policy. But let's look at what else. So now that we know that Saudi Arabia is dependent on the US, how else would they cave in? I think it's important to note that the Yemeni war, for example, is one that is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that means the US is in a juncture to deal with this sort of negotiation. We posit the reason why the US is unable to structurally deal with this political power play in the Middle East is because it is uniformly seen as an ally to Saudi Arabia in all instances. That is to say, the US has no neutrality in the way it deals with negotiations between parties allied to Iran and parties allied to Saudi Arabia. What changes here? We would posit, maybe this is not the only reason why negotiations have failed. It's a very big reason. And removing this reason is extremely important. At this moment, there is no interest by Iran to cater to any sort of policies or deals that is presented by the US because it is seen as a Saudi Arabian funded operation. That is to say, any sort of deal presented on the table right now is to the benefit of Saudi Arabia. It's very apparent because all the sorts of problems faced by Iran is something Saudi Arabia get away with, sort of political reforms that don't exist, the sort of problems that necessarily take place. And what that means is we would say and posit that there's you increase the political willingness of individuals from Iran, like Hassan Rouhani, to gain more political legitimacy in agreeing with the US deal amongst its people, particularly the supreme leader, when the US deal is not seen as one that is necessarily Saudi Arabian funded. Next, if we allow for that sort of change within the Iran-Yemeni war, what that means is we might not get to end the war with one particular victor, but at least what we get to do is a mediation between the two parties and hence a power sharing deal within Yemen. There is one alternative, just quote, more viable in our world than it is in theirs. But how does this all boil down to the likelihood of Saudi Arabia doing this? I think the context of Saudi Arabia right now is extremely important, presented by Saray. That is to say, MPS is at a critical juncture in reforms to liberalization and modernization. We would agree that there are benefits that Saudi Arabia has been doing in terms of change. That is, they've been practicing military coordination, etc., like opening opposition line outlined. That is the main reason why it's the best time to do so. It empowers MBS and his political legitimacy in the sense that they're able to necessarily weaponize the US sanctions to crack down on Wahhabism, because you allow for the sort of rhetoric such that Wahhabism is the only barrier towards US support and Saudi modernization and liberalization. The inability for MBS right now to fully combat Wahhabism is because the US is still literally complicit in allowing for those sort of human rights abuses to go unchecked. Allowing MBS to weaponize this rhetoric is one that allows him to win amongst his conservative opponents. What we fight for in opening government is that we fight for a change that is dependent on Saudi Arabia. Given that right now they're dependent on the US more so than ever, it is time we take a step to change. Thank you very much.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. To wrap up the opening debate, I call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition. You have the floor. Hear, hear.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has changed about 20 times in the last 40 years. I don't think when MDS has staked his entire legacy on a pivot towards United States foreign policy, which, as they note, is apparently entirely contingent on continued United States support, that he will, I just don't think he will continue to be the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia for very long, right? That would be a catastrophic failure of every idea that he has posited to Saudi Arabia in terms of liberalization, which means that all of the sorts of incentive analysis that this side has posited that MDS has in order to change all of the wars in Yemen and any of the other oppressive policies that apparently exist on this side are incredibly implausible, because he would look even more like a US crony, he would look substantially weaker, and it would just be seen as an absolute deviation from whatever legacy that he wanted. It's just deeply unclear why any of the actors that they assert will respond in ways that they have said they will respond will actually do so, just beyond really just a few assertions about it. So I can start my time. Does anyone have one? Thanks, second. Cool. Guess that's 1 minute. So first question in this speech. Why is Saudi Arabia unlikely to change its policies in response to this? The first thing, as goes basically unresponded to from James's speech, is that they substantially fear an increase of Iranian power. That's for 3 reasons. First, because they violated most of the terms of the nuclear deal, and the United States hasn't really done much in response except Trump has waved his small hands around. The second thing is, they have currently seen Iran have the sanctions that have been put on them for the last few decades removed by both the EU and the United States for the first time in years. And then that is additionally compounded by the United States then pulling out its support for Saudi Arabia, which is likely to make them think that their position is even more fragile. The third thing to say is that Yemen is crucially important for Saudi Arabia. One, because they need a more favorable government there to the extent they're likely to see the rise of Sunni powers in Iraq. But also, secondly, they need to show themselves as the most plausible protector of Sunnis in the region, to the extent that they fear, for example, a return to something like the al-Maliki government in Iraq, because that was not very good for them, to the extent they wanted to prosper the Sunni nation across the Middle East to prosper. They say in response to this, like, they can't buy Russian arms, it's really expensive, things like that. I don't know. Saudi Arabia is a sovereign state. They can purchase finances, they can issue government bonds. They're nowhere near peak oil in that particular region, and it's quite likely, for reasons I'll expand on further, oil prices will increase as a result of this policy. They can also just get revenue for a whole variety of places. They're very unlikely to default. They're a sovereign country. They can back their own currency, they can print more. I reckon Russia's probably going to give them pretty favorable deals on those things anyway, to the extent that they want to like increase their power in that particular region. And as a result, it's deeply unclear to me why any of the things that are told to us about the capacity of Saudi Arabia to do these things with or without US support are unlikely. So what happens? And these are the two comparatives that deeply lost OG in this debate. Because first, they're most likely to move to Russia. The response we get here is twofold. The first is Russia is economically weak, which makes selling weapons to Saudi Arabia a pretty good idea for establishing their economic superiority. The second thing to say is I think one of the best things you can do to empower your position as Russia economically is to collectively control almost the entire EU oil supply in conjunction with Russia and Saudi Arabia, given that is where most of the pipelines have to travel through in order to reach Europe, and they do not have access to certain things. The response we get to this from CG is like shale gas exists. Obviously, the United States is not yet entirely independent from oil. They do not have 100% shale gas reserves to power their entire economy. Our condition is that they will have to move more towards oil in the immediate short term, and will have to continue to do so, but those things will be more expensive. The next response that we get is like, but Russia is already allied with Iran's kind of sort of, so they're unlikely to do this, which sort of doesn't really make sense for Russia, given any other sort of foreign policy that Russia is engaged in. We point to the way in which they were both allied with Vietnam and China during the Vietnam War, and Congo and Uganda when they were at war as well. They are much more of a pragmatic actor than that. They just want to further their own particular power. It's not like the fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran happen to dislike each other means that Russia can't benefit from both sides of that deal by playing both of its games. But it's even worse if it's the case that this side is correct, that they lose all of their funding, for the reason they are more likely to revert to funding things like Wahhabism in order to increase their soft power over the region by destabilizing all the other countries. The reason for that is because if you strip them of the entirety of their funding, the thing that they know is quite successful is radicalizing a whole bunch of young men such that they're likely to engage in terrorist activities, and that's a hell of a lot worse for this side, because you can't predict those actions as the United States, they're much harder to break up, and they're much less controllable. And finally, you have much less information about those things at the point where you've pulled out of Saudi Arabia, you're no longer engaging with the government or the extent to which they're setting policy about the education policies of madrasas and things like that. So you are unlikely to be able to stop that. So it's either the case you move to Russia or you move to like funding madrasas and Wahhabism more. Both of those things are worth for the United States, the region, and also to Saudi Arabia. But the second part of this speech is why, even if none of that's true, the type of moderation that we get for Saudi Arabia is better. As I've already noted in my introduction, this particular crown prince is especially tied to the United States. There is no reason beyond the assertion that they will be able to weaponize US sanctions, whatever the hell that means, that MBS will actually fit his policies. Because he's likely to look astonishingly weak. He's made a large number of enemies amongst other princes to the extent that he's imprisoned a lot of them under charges of corruption. So they are likely to push for his removal in ways that mean that. If he looks even weaker just by responding to the threat of the removal of US funding, that is much, much worse. So given that is the case, especially in the unique context Saudi Arabia is in at the moment, where they're uniquely scared of Iran gaining power for the first time in decades, and as they can see, the regime is uniquely unstable as a result of the prosecution for corruption of specific individuals, it is utterly destructive to the perspective of that individual being the king of Saudi Arabia in the future, for him to backflip rather on any of those policies. I will first take closing. Okay.
So MBS is hugely consolidated in his power and he controls the media and sees Wahhabism as a threat to his rule. There's no reason why he would implement Wahhabism or lose the massive amount of popularity he has by solving youth unemployment rates and making it the most popular crown prince in recent history.
I mean, he wouldn't have no other option and would lose more power in Saudi Arabia, which has been our entire case so far. You've just discussed what his interests are. I think our characterization is probably more plausible. So, thirdly, on reasonable stability. The first thing is, Israel is likely to see itself as more at risk as a result of this policy. At the moment, Saudi Arabia is currently engaging in military sort of practice things with Israel. That has meant that it's able to close that alliance such that Israel feels less a threat from countries like Iran. We think they're far more likely to wrap up aggression in the region to the extent they feel less safe, and they feel like the United States is now backing away from them as well. That is likely to further increase regional instability. The last thing to say is this will also decrease the capacity to fight the rise of terrorism in that region to the extent that other allies are unlikely to be able to provide the same types of information about the spread of things like Wahhabism as Saudi Arabia, to the extent that they are continuing to engage with the United States. We have won this debate in 3 ways. First, we have proved that Saudi Arabia is not dependent and the alternative paths that they would take are worse. Second, even if it was dependent, this was a less effective way to moderate the regime. And third, even if that was the best way to moderate tolerate the regime, we need regional stability in ways that work for the entire region. We want to stay on every conceivable level.
The Muslim world as much as you can. So what you can do, and we say this very active debate, is you drop the other hot potato in the Middle East. The Saudi Arabia has become an inconvenient ally because they invade Yemen, arrest the prime minister, and put it in a hotel. They become the new bully of the Arab League. And we point out that given the strategic choices that the USA has already made, it makes sense to drop Saudi Arabia because it makes Israel happy and safer, as well as the Arab League, and it's generally a good saving measure. I'm going to talk about two things in extension. One, why this move is a necessary trade-off given USA's strategic choices so far, and number two, how all the likely outcomes of this pan out in USA's favor, deepening the emphasis from open government. First, let's talk about why this move is a necessary trade-off. Because we acknowledge that for the USA is always a priority balancing act between domestic politics and catering to the Israeli lobby versus the foreign policy. And since we've made the Jerusalem decision, and this is a retrospective debate like we pointed out, they're in a bit of a sticky mess. So they need to do what they can to preserve whatever goodwill is left. Why is Saudi Arabia such a good chip to trade off? Three reasons. Number one, because of recent moves that they've made, they are often hated by the Arab League. I think OG's done a pretty good job of this. But secondly, we want to deepen it further by pointing out that Mohammed bin Salman is a particularly uncertain actor, given that a lot of what he's doing right now to consolidate power is to discard the old hard loyalty to the House of Saud and the special relationship that existed. Although this means that even if you hold on to Saudi Arabia, there's no guarantee MBS specifically is going to hold you in prime of place. But we look now at the Gulf Coast countries and how they weigh up the trend. Because bear in mind that even though they are very angry about the Palestinian issue, a lot of these countries often use the Palestinian gambit as something to draw out local support in their own countries. Which is to say, at the point that Saudi Arabia is a much more direct threat to their own security, and if proven really to disempower the Saudis, they're much more likely to forgive or close their mind to the Palestinian issue, which they see as perennial and insoluble anyway. This means likely the move and trade-off you're making will either mitigate the backlash you get to a large extent, if not, you're making new friends altogether. This therefore preserves the USA's bargaining chip, given the choices it has really decided unimportant for itself. Second extension, all about those two intermovement, this I'll get on to opening up, how the likely outcomes all pan out in the USA's favor. But before that. Oh, okay, oh sure, alright. So now, what opening up said, Saudi Arabia will run off to Russia and China for weapons. I think OG did a fairly good job analyzing that sounds like people hate each other, but we will point out that Mohammed bin Salman won't want to be an enemy of the rest of the other crown princes who easily assert his position by allying with the Syrian's biggest benefactor, therefore extending analysis of Razzaq. But even if it doesn't matter, this is where we provide even more analysis, hang on. We saw in the news about 2 days ago that Russia is announcing a withdrawal of troops from Syria. What this means is that Russia has also recognized that its position in Syria is untenable for long. At the point that Russia is already trying to scale down its own presence, if the USA matches this, it is in a good position that no one is going to realistically fill the gap. And even to bring up China for some reason, China particularly has no foreign policy wish to be the only hegemon in the area. Although this means Saudi Arabia is actually likely to be left with very little alternatives. Then they argue that there will be an oil deadlock because the USA has not yet transitioned to full energy self-sufficiency. The point is getting there. So here's the point. About 2 years ago, the USA finally transitioned from a net energy importer to a net energy exporter because they've liberalized gas export policies to the Sabine Pass, which means we can now use LNG for their own domestic users as well as foreign users. And for oil, when they want to talk about transitioning, they legalize the Keystone XL pipeline, which is to say the biggest source of the monopolies that Saudi Arabia has over the US is become much more ineffective due to recent developments. But even in the case that Saudi Arabia never comes back, they never want to talk to you again, we are very happy for that to happen. Because why? The USA, as it is now, is very okay to reduce its global presence and not getting involved in conflicts which are not of its own making because they do not serve its direct strategic interests.
Sorry about the last time. Can you just give us some examples of the type of Arab countries you want to pull into the US corner and how you propose pulling these countries into their corner would be good for the world?
Okay, so on that. So third part of the extension is likely what are the outcomes of this. Why will Saudi Arabia probably come crawling back along with the other US allies that you want to talk about, right? So what other natural allies can the USA make if it dumps Saudi Arabia? Look at all the people who don't have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, probably more important to USA. For example, Turkey, which has a lot of refueling embassies in ensuring if the USA wants to project power to the region, Turkey is also strategically positioned to do so. Or it can always offer a solution to managing the Kurdish issue in the other nations because Saudi Arabia are also at odds. At the point you become a good bargaining power with the Kurds, if you really want to do that kind of policy, you're also more able to walk the talk. I will also point out that a lot of the reform and deeper from opening government is predicated in Saudi Arabia, is predicated on Mohammed bin Salman's ability to privatize Aramco. So what we'll give you now is a specific reasons as to why the USA is so critical and why it has meaningful leverage to change Saudi Arabia's plans. Because unlike OG, who didn't seem to know this, New York Stock Exchange capital markets are the deepest in the world. Aramco is estimated to be the largest company in the world by total revenue, $1 trillion market capitalization. Although only the capital markets in the USA, nowhere else in the world have the ability to scope up at Aramco like IPO. The Russian capital market is sluggish and who knows what goes on in Shanghai anyway. So at a point when you specifically and all support Saudi Arabia and cover the preferential access to your liquidity, your capital markets, so they can't go around. Otherwise, this particularly is the leverage that the USA has over Saudi Arabia. So at the point Saudi Arabia needs your military and access to capital markets, you're likely to renegotiate the deal and come back to you. But instead of a situation in which the USA is trying to maintain a failing relationship, now Saudi Arabia is coming to us USA for support and to renegotiate terms, therefore allowing USA to bargain from a better position. Teachings one is made in two ways. One is analyzing the strategic shift and what's important, and two is showing you how meaningful leverage leads to a better spectrum of likely outcomes across the board. We're very proud to propose.
I thank the member of government for that speech. Now I call on the member of opposition to have the floor.
I think it is. Hang on. No, it's working. It's working. Sorry. I think it is fair to say that there's a reasonable amount of uncertainty as to what will happen in this debate. Namely, we're not fully sure what Saudi Arabia will look like, not fully sure what the region will look like as a whole. What we're going to provide you in closing opposition is two things that you can be sure of. Around two ideas. Number one, oil prices, and we're going to explain the actual mechanism by which they rise, and then give you the actual impacts of why that's such a bad thing. Secondly, I'm going to talk about leverage over Israel within the region, why it's actually critical that the US has multiple allies that it can turn to, and losing Saudi Arabia unnecessarily empowers Israel. Lastly, if I have time, I'm going to wade into the opening half debate a little bit and explain why, under a more plausible framework, what actually happens, that opening up actually use for most of their speeches, why the liberalization that occurs within Saudi Arabia is going to stop, and why we should actually care about that. Firstly, three responses to what we get from closing government. So, number one, we get told that this is the idea that the US has already moved in a particular direction, it's already doing certain things, ergo, it needs to continue in that vein. Number one, I'm just unclear why that's true. If that was a bad direction to move in, I think the US should stop doing that and not behave in ways that are like that. Secondly, I'd note that this isn't a debate about the interest of the US, no thank you, and therefore I'm largely not that concerned about what, for example, Trump's administration is doing. Rather, we should care about broad-scale people that we care about on the ground. But secondly, the actual meat of this case is to say, well, look, MBS has proved himself to be an unreliable person who does somewhat crazy things by regional standards, ergo, we should drop him. Number one, insofar as the outcome that we're claiming from opposition is more instability in the region, worse things happening to people, I think at that point the US looks like a worse ally for these people for lots of reasons. Number two, Saudi is still a very powerful player within the region, and insofar as you turn them away, as the US turns away from them and they're likely to be pissed off with them, it is more likely that Saudi will say, well, look, we want you also to reject US things, given their proximity to them, we think that's bad. Lastly, we POI on, who are they actually going to turn to, full stop. And the response is Turkey, a country that is already a US ally and a member of NATO. I'm unclear what the difference that it actually makes in this case is. All of this is to say, I think this case is incredibly speculative and not actually at the meat of what this motion is about. We, by contrast, are going to give you some certainty. Number one, let's talk about oil prices. So, there are a variety of things that might happen once Saudi breaks ties with the US. They might have various different allies, they might do various different things. What we suggest is it is this uncertainty in and of itself, where we can't tell what the outcome is going to be, that is likely to cause a rise in the oil prices. So if we just look at all the things that have to be factored into investor decisions when this policy comes into place, you're talking in the most extreme cases about potential regime changes. You're talking about policy changes. You don't know what's going to happen with the Aramco flow. You're talking about large-scale uncertainty with one of the largest producers of oil in the world and the head, or de facto head, of OPEC, right? What we suggest that will mean is people will think that oil, the flow might go down, ultimately don't know, and therefore be more likely to stockpile oil and correspondingly raise the prices. That is the actual mechanism under which, no matter what the outcome is, those prices are likely to go up. Why should we actually care about this? Number one, it hurts poor people on the ground across the world, at the point where that energy costs more, at the point where filling up their car costs more, you increase prices on those people and lower the quality of their lives in a very, very real way. Number two, you cause contractions in the global economy writ large, because at the point where people have to spend more money on their fuel, they have to spend less money on other things, and you tend to get general contraction of economies. That means slower spending, that means less growth. In extreme cases, that means increases in unemployment. It means people getting sicker. It means people dying, ladies and gentlemen. This will affect an enormous number of people, and we think you should weight that extremely highly within this debate. Lastly, as has already been mentioned, raising oil prices empowers Russia, probably something by and large we don't want to do in comparison as an actor. We think that's incredibly important. Secondly, let's talk about leverage over Israel within the region, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So US shale gas firms have spare capacity to meet any rise in demand when there's a rise in oil prices. That's why the recent OPEC initiative to restrict oil price, restrict supply, didn't really do much to oil prices. It's not really certain.
So I'm sorry, right? The effect of that raise in oil, that drop in oil prices, was to actively cut shale production across the world, right? That's why the US shale production slowed so massively, because they couldn't operate under a certain level. Even if it is the case that raising oil prices means at some point that they might become functional again, there is still a time lag during which all of the effects that I've just talked about will happen. We think that's still bad. No, thank you. Secondly, let's talk about leverage over Israel within the region, right? Because we suggest that the US is able to gain advantages by funding both Saudi Arabia and also Israel within the Middle East. Why is this a good thing, right? Because it means that when the US wants things from within the region, it has an option for who it can turn to. So, for example, bases for military expeditions, surgical interventions, and also gaining military intelligence. This means neither of those actors is able to gain too much leverage over the United States, because insofar as the one you wanted to go to first says, well, I want certain things in demand, I want support for particular policies, it is easier for the US to say, well, it might not be ideal, but I can turn to somebody else. That also keeps them in check in what they're likely to demand of the US and recognize that they have less leverage.
What this means is that Israel now has a disproportionate amount of leverage over the United States because it runs short on people in the region who it is able to turn support to, right? So that means that Israel is more able to say, we will demand certain things. We think, for example, we need you to support our building of settlements in the West Bank, for example. No, number one, even insofar as current US policy is not something that looks like it will push back against Israel on those things, this also ties you to the future insofar as you're severing ties with Saudi Arabia, makes it less likely that anybody will be able to push back on those things. We say that hurts Palestinians on the ground, and that again is something concrete that you should care about. Lastly, let's talk briefly about the liberalization. Look, we get claims from opening government that this is a tool by which MBS is now able to say, aha, we need to enact these reforms. I mean, I think like opening opposition has already covered like potentially he loses power and things like that. What I think is probably more likely to happen, right, is at this point, MBS has to make a political calculation whereby he says, well, I'm probably going to have to reject my previous policies. So I will push back against the West. I will say this was their fault, as indeed opening government actively wanted to point out. I think at that point, you are likely to have to move away from those policies. Moreover, insofar as what they say is true and you need to be able to gain more support, I think it is more likely that he will say, yeah, actually, I do need more support. I will turn to the Wahhabists in this case. Why does this actually matter? Because those liberalizations, again, are things that we should care about for ordinary Saudi Arabians on the ground. We should care about the fact that women should be able to drive within the country and gain some measure of freedom against an extremely patriarchal society. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, we think you should go with what you can know in this debate. We think you should go with closing opposition.
And thank you, member of opposition, for that speech. To wrap up the cases for side government, I'll call the last speaker from government side. Government, you have the floor.
Yes, sir.
For far too long has the United States been led around the nose by the bad guys, powerless to prevent the power base that result in the destabilization of foreign governments and progressive movements that want to combat the Republican, and powerless but to be accused of the lapdog of the House of Soviets. We think that revoking support to these guys is probably the best way to start on a clean slate. There were two things I'll be talking about in my speech. All rebuttal will be amalgamated. First, what's better for the US's position via the Middle East, and second, what's better for Middle East stability. Let's first talk about what's better for the US in particular. Because the first thing that we heard from closing opposition was that Israel has a huge influence on the US. To the extent that it's true, we think that this is particularly a retrospective debate, and we probably have to set a certain sunk cost to begin with. Trump is not going to pivot away from Israel if they want to claim otherwise. But even if what they wanted to say was true, we think that the best way to counter Israel is not dependent to an ally who tends to change a crown prince 20 times over 20 years, but rather to have one that is more stable. In that, we have Turkey. We have Turkey who's able to act in a more cautious factor, primarily because it has structural incentives to ensure that you have a diplomatic core like Erdogan and his cronies that allow people to be able, that allow the US to be able to treat in good faith with this particular allies. We are talking about allies like Turkey who are willing to be able to give you alternative means of support rather than have to strong arm you into doing things like be quiet and be complicit about what happens in Yemen under those particular instances. But then they said that this debate really is about oil prices. No, thank you, Teck. We think that oil prices are probably unlikely to rise, primarily because it is very hard for Saudi Arabia to do that, particularly when it has less say on OPEC, particularly when it's no longer the strongest arm of OPEC, when perhaps years of infrastructure construction in Indonesia primarily means that Indonesia is now the largest producer of oil and has the largest say in this particular community. But even if what they say is true, we don't think this is particularly relevant in this particular debate. Given that the US is the largest producer of shale oil and gas, we say that oil prices are a good thing for the US. It allows them to be able to export price oil better to the community, to overseas communities. At the same time, the fact that the US massively subsidizes its domestic oil industries means that the US is unlikely to be hurt by any spike in oil prices mandated by OPEC because you still get cheap oil for US citizens on the ground. But even if that's true, we're happy to say that the US doesn't necessarily need to conform to an oil-rich industry in the first place. The fact that we are diversifying to clean coal, whatever Trump wants to mean by that, or nuclear energy, or the fact that the US can easily shift to other fairly advanced, sustainable green tech if it wants to, given if Trump decides to change his mind, or if Trump loses in the next election, means it's very easy for the US to shift dominance away from oil. Okay, they want to say, this is not about US oil, this is also about the EU. And this is the line of argumentation that came up from opening opposition at the point they wanted to say, you now increase the possibility of Russia and the Middle East collaborating to impose a monopolistic control over oil in the EU. Firstly, we think that they didn't really run a comparative because we also see in the status quo that Russia and the Middle East are also doing fairly nasty things to the EU in terms of oil control and their inability to speak on those matters. But we also say that the EU itself isn't particularly a weak actor to begin with, that the US ought to be concerned about. If they want to be concerned about such things, they can always treat with Middle Eastern actors and play up progressive support and play up new progressive allies within this community as they have done in the past. Opening.
This isn't either an active debate nor a retrospective debate, and I don't know why your team thinks it is. But if the entire government's case is true that MPSS is relying on US support, as you say, why are they not convinced to change its actions by making threats of doing this or otherwise sanctioning him personally, as was our case from the beginning?
So we had a previous debate where we were told to discuss whether a person who lives a short life is probably going to live it better. And we think that's true. If MSP is unlikely going to be in power for very long, he's probably not going to pander to whims of rationality or what his long-term interests are if the possibility is he might be ousted in the long run. And the same applies here. If he's probably going to be ousted in the short run, we might as well make that power play. But regardless, we already established clearly in OG that this is not someone whom the US can probably treat with. And we also say, and to that extent, we think it's far harder for you to prove your outcome. CEO has conceded that by further saying that there's so much uncertainty in this debate. Okay, so what's better for Middle East stability? If the premise of OJ's case is that you think this is worse for regional stability in the Middle East, we think our side does it better. Even if we take the best case that Saudi Arabia may pivot to Russia, we don't think a pivoting scenario is necessarily bad. Firstly, because it doesn't hurt US interests. But secondly, the fact that they consider that Iran continues to be a direct antagonist to Saudi Arabia kind of indicates that Saudi Arabia is unlikely to be given a blank check to hurt Middle Eastern interests in the long run. Last I checked, Iran continues to have a strong military capable of combating Syria, Saudi Arabia, has a strong economy backed by oil, and its risk-taking in wanting to demonstrably breaking certain international conventions kind of means that this is often a loose cannon that rational countries like Saudi Arabia would rather not want to deal with. Third, we've proven under the best case scenario that Saudi Arabia is unlikely to be the bad guy just because we remove support. But we don't think it's the only scenario. Lucas gave you analysis that Russia is beginning to withdraw from Iran, that China wouldn't want to be seen to be the only power broker in the area. So we think under that particular scenario, nothing changes, and at least the US is not complicit in not being able to voice out in their atrocities against Iran. There are many other scenarios that we can talk about. The fact that stability might decrease, but we think this is probably a good thing because we think that people all have a right to self-determine their own fate. The fact that stability is now being weakening probably means that the Wahhabis and the South House societies are more likely going to lose control. They're more likely going to have an instance where people, where progressive voices in Saudi Arabia might be able to prevail against this authoritarian structure. And we say that what we do at the point we relinquish control of Saudi Arabia is that we give the Middle East back to the Middle Eastern people.
Thank you, Dr. Wu, for that speech. Wrapped up the grand finals of WUPID 2017. I invite the last speaker of the House, Opposition Leader.
Good. Three parts of the speech. Number one, response to CG. Number two, framing. Number three, why do we start from something? CG started this debate very quickly for the simple reason that they didn't respond to all the challenges to be memorable. The case goes as follows. We need to solve the problem of Turkey treating the Kurds badly. Ergo, since Saudi Arabia is already hated by the Arab League, if we hurt Saudi Arabia, the Arabs certainly love the Americans. Number one, Turkey is already a NATO member. Unclear why we need more leverage or how this materializes. Number two, the Arab League kind of hates the US too for historical reasons and the fact that these destabilize regions. Unclear why this will tip the balance one way or the other. Third of all, this action on the House is absolutely no guarantee that the Arab League will do anything. It amounts to nothing more than a request for help, saying, I've done something good for you, or pro quo, you should do something nice for me. I'm just not sure why we should gamble the stability of the region on the possibility that some real political leaders and some realist leaders will suddenly say, this is a good way to repay the favor the US has given us. I'm just not sure why they would create meaningful change. Framing. Why should you, in this debate, pick certainty over probability or speculative effects that the top half quibbles over? I point to what happened in Iraq in 2003, thank you, where the best analysts in the world looked at a mountain of evidence and said, aha, if we invade and create regime change, it will be very likely we will stabilize the Middle East. And we all know what happened then. It happened to things like unknown unknowns. There were situations in which you just could not reasonably foresee, given the best arguments to make about the situation at the time. I think there are remarkable parallels here, because as a panel, you have no way of determining what the situation or the dynamic or the balance of power really is in Saudi Arabia. Given things like MBS control, no thank you. Given things like the fact that MBS has power groups that might be stronger or weaker, but that in the Western world, we simply have no way of evaluating. Crucially, therefore, when you wear the top hat, you will find yourself facing many deadlocks, because very often, one side says one thing about the nature of the regime, and the other side asserts the exact opposite. And the fact of the matter is, no thank you, under the history books are written, we often have no way of knowing which of these is the case. As a result of this is what the top of the debate looks like. It looks incredibly mitigatory on off, and it looks incredibly bold on prop. Trump wants to fix like 1,001 problems ranging from Yemen to Wahhabism, the economic problems in Saudi Arabia. They all have the same mechanism. Crucially, that if the US does this one thing, it will Saudi Arabia will respond in all these ways. Likewise, opening up case simply says that there's all these alternatives. The answer is probably something in the middle, right? There's no real certainty the MPS will go. They'll probably be weak in some areas and make some of the political trade-off. It's unclear what any of those things will be. As a result, when you treat this debate off against each other, a lot of these harms are not that significantly different from the status quo. For example, when opening up claims that Wahhabism will get worse, arguably this is already happening to a degree as MPS wrestles with power domestically. When they say we need a reliable ally as the United States of America, they undermine their own case when they then point out there are alternatives like Russia and China, which means that they might be an ally, but they sure as hell won't be reliable in the sense that they care about. How do you resolve this deadlock? Thank you. You resolve this deadlock by doing what everyone sane has done with regards to the Middle East, by not creating more instability at the point where that hurts your interests and the global economy. That's what we transform. No, thank you. So, on uncertainty, we told you this uncertainty pervades many levels. It happens at the regime and policy change level. Basically, if you can't decide the deadlock, do you think investors are going to be able to do so? To decide what the futures or the price of oil will be 5 years from now? Probably not. At the point where no one knows what the IPO of Aramco is going to look like, because we have no idea whether it's going to happen in the Netherlands or New York or in London. Again, no idea how to predict Saudi Arabia's commercial interests. No, thank you. And as a result, how they will decide to price oil. If you can't decide this deadlock on whether Russia or China will step in and to what degree, once again, investors are expected to make the same decisions when it comes to predicting the price of oil and hence purchasing futures before these things happen to try and gain demand going forward. Ergo, what is likely to happen is a situation in which prices increase amidst this instability, or at the very least, fluctuations increase. What did CG say to this? They said 3 things. Number one, they said Saudi Arabia has reduced stake in OPEC and gave an example of Indonesia. But thank you. I mean, sure, that might be a marginal increase. It's not clear why the power dynamic meaningfully changes in these cases. But given that our case wasn't just about Saudi direct control, it was what the result this would have on the market that was unresponsive. The second thing they say is that the US wants increased oil prices because it wants to export something. Export what exactly? The US wants a global economy that is humming along, and thank you, with oil prices would tank that tremendously. Because crucially, the other trading partners purchase the products that it is creating, and when Louis tells you that oil prices moving around crazily hurts the economies of these countries, that goes against the broader US interest as a result of any global economy. Last of all, they point out that the US can shift away, for example, look at things like shale. Number one, as we already preempted, the problem with shale is there's a huge amount of lag or downtime, which means that control. Number two, it's only profitable at a certain level, and that level is significantly higher than what the oil price is today. Ergo, it still means there's going to be a meaningful increase in all the harms we talked about come about. Just because that gets capped at a level of at which shale becomes profitable again does not change that. But last and most importantly of all, this debate is about perhaps part of the US's interest, but the claim we are making is for the global economy as a whole. Just because the US can respond through shale and a pipeline that runs across its northern border says nothing about whether Asia will be able to do so, whether China will be able to do so, whether Latin America and the broader EU will be able to do so. What is the snapshot of all of this?
Okay, other than your egregious new material, why is that ironclad security guarantee the best response to a consistent world?
Because it's ironclad and it's secure and it's a pretty damn big harm. Here's the harm. The harm is it hurts poor people. The harm is it tanks the global economy and slows it down because you can't make predictions about what that economy will look like in 5 years amidst a turbulent recovery. Not just harmful to the US directly, although it obviously is, given that USA is a fairly interconnected economy, but it's bad for tons of people around the world. And worst of all, as Louis tells you, to the extent that higher oil prices creates more space for regimes like in Venezuela and Russia to do bad things. So thank you. That is a harm as well with regards to global stability in many other ways. When you contrast this to the claims of all other teams, OOOG and CG, you will realize that all they are saying is that a fairly unstable regime is going to get marginally less stable. We're telling you why the world, which without this action would generally be coming along as an economy and recovering at a rate that is significantly better than it is today, will get significantly worse. That's something you should price in significantly higher. Last of all, Israel received no response, but the thematic arguments for why you should weigh this up are pretty much the same, right? That Saudi and Israel are imperfect substitutes strategically, but crucially having multiple imperfect substitutes stop any single one of them by screwing you over, by having you by the balls. The response is, it is better if we have a stable partner like Turkey. Ironic, given that their whole case was about raiding Turkey in the darn first place, that they want Turkey to be the substitute. The situation of leverage they create is one in which we are bound more significantly to Israel, which means Israel can walk over the US and by extension, the people in places like the West Bank or the Middle East more broadly. We don't want to create a permanent but certain situation of leverage that falls one way or the other. For all these reasons, pretty darn big harms, pretty certain they will come about no matter which other team wins the debate in terms of the arguments they were making. Proud to oppose.
I think all the speakers on the panels, I encourage everyone to close.